The sirens began at midnight. Across Tokyo's darkened streets, 10 million souls stirred from restless sleep as the haunting wail pierced the March air. Children clutched their mothers' hands. Fathers peered through blackout curtains at searchlights sweeping the sky like ghostly fingers. This was March 9, 1945, a night that would sear itself into history's memory forever. Then came the rumble. Low, distant, growing stronger. Not the familiar drone of high-flying bombers, but something different. Something terrifyingly close. 334 American B-29 super fortresses swept across Tokyo Bay at just 1,500 feet. So low that civilians could see the bomb bay doors yawning open like hungry mouths. What fell from the sky wasn't steel or explosives. It was liquid fire. Thousands of incendiary canisters burst open above the wooden rooftops, spilling jellied gasoline and napalm like burning rain. Within minutes, entire city blocks erupted into towering walls of flame. The fire spread faster than people could run, leaping from house to house, street to street, consuming everything in its path. Families who had survived years of war found themselves trapped in a nightmare beyond imagination. The wind, superheated by the inferno, began to howl like a living thing. Fire tornadoes, spinning columns of flame reaching toward the heavens, tore through neighborhoods, incinerating everything they touched. The very air became poisonous. Rivers boiled. Asphalt melted into flowing streams of tar. By dawn, 16 square miles of Tokyo had vanished. Over 100,000 civilians lay dead, more than would perish in either atomic bombing. The weapon that shocked Japan wasn't nuclear. It was fire itself, weaponized and unleashed with surgical precision against an entire city. But this was only the beginning. The Empire of the Rising Sun was about to discover that sometimes the most devastating weapons aren't the most advanced. Sometimes they're simply the most merciless. The Japan of early 1945 was a nation walking on the edge of a blade. 4 years of war had drained the empire's lifeblood. Admiral Yamamoto's once mighty combined fleet lay scattered across the Pacific floor. The legendary Zero fighters that had terrorized Pearl Harbor now fell like autumn leaves to American Hellcats and Corsairs. Supply convoys, strangled by submarine warfare, no longer reached the home islands with adequate food or fuel. Yet, on the surface, the facade of invincibility persisted. Radio broadcasts proclaimed glorious victories, while civilians queued for rice, rations that grew smaller each week. Children learned to bow toward the imperial palace while their fathers melted family heirlooms into bullets. The Bushido spirit, the way of the warrior, demanded death before dishonor, surrender before defeat. In hushed conversations behind paper walls, ordinary Japanese whispered fears they dared not voice aloud. American bombers had begun appearing over the mainland with increasing frequency. The B-29s, those silver giants the Japanese called Binijuku, flew higher than any interceptor could reach. They seemed untouchable, dropping their loads with mechanical precision before vanishing into the stratosphere. But something had changed in the American strategy. Intelligence reports spoke of new tactics, different targets. The precision bombing of aircraft factories and steel mills was giving way to something far more ominous. American generals, frustrated by Japan's refusal to acknowledge reality, were preparing to bring the war home to every man, woman, and child in the empire. The breaking point had arrived. Japan's leaders, blinded by pride and ideology, could not see what was coming. The American war machine, having perfected the art of destruction over Europe, was about to turn its full fury upon the wooden cities of Japan. The stage was set for a campaign that would redefine the very nature of warfare, and test the limits of human endurance. The transformation began in the mind of one man. General Curtis LeMay, hard-faced and uncompromising, studied the intelligence reports with cold calculation. The precision bombing campaign wasn't working fast enough. Japanese aircraft production continued despite regular raids on factories. Civilian morale remained stubbornly high. Something more dramatic was needed. Something that would shake the very foundations of Japanese society. LeMay's solution was brutal in its simplicity. Instead of targeting military installations, he would target the cities themselves. Japanese urban areas were tinderboxes waiting for a spark. Wooden houses packed together like matchsticks. Narrow streets that would channel flames into roaring infernos. Entire districts that could be consumed in a single night. The weapon already existed. In the laboratories and testing grounds of America, scientists had perfected the art of creating fire. Me-69 incendiary bombs, each packed with jellied gasoline that would stick to any surface and burn for 15 minutes. Napalm, a thick, syrupy mixture that could turn water itself into flame. Magnesium canisters that burned at temperatures hot enough to melt steel. These weren't random weapons of destruction. They were precisely engineered tools of psychological warfare. Each bomb was designed to spread fire in a specific pattern, creating interlocking webs of flame that would trap civilians in expanding pockets of death. The timing of the drops, the altitude of approach, even the weather conditions. Everything was calculated to maximize the horror. LeMay's doctrine represented a fundamental shift in military thinking. This wasn't about destroying enemy capability. It was about destroying enemy will. The factories could be rebuilt, but the memory of an entire city burning in a single night, that would scar the Japanese psyche forever. In briefing rooms across the Pacific, American aircrews studied aerial photographs and target maps. They memorized the layout of Tokyo's most densely populated districts. They practiced formation, flying at dangerously low altitudes. Most had no idea they were preparing to unleash hell itself upon 10 million civilians. The weapon that would shock Japan was taking shape, forged not in the atomic laboratories of Los Alamos, but in the cold, strategic calculations of men who understood that sometimes victory requires embracing the unthinkable. The night of March 9, 1945, began like any other wartime evening in Tokyo. Families gathered around meager dinners, rationing their words as carefully as their food. Children studied by candlelight while mothers mended clothes with thread pulled from old garments. The city settled into an uneasy sleep, wrapped in the familiar embrace of blackout darkness. At 11:30 p.m., the first Pathfinder aircraft crossed the coastline. These weren't the high-altitude bombers Tokyo's defenders expected. They flew at 1,500 feet, so low that anti-aircraft guns couldn't depress far enough to track them. The element of surprise was complete. Operation Meeting House had begun. 334 B-29 super fortresses, each carrying 6 tons of incendiary bombs, swept across Tokyo Bay in perfectly coordinated waves. The Pathfinders marked the target zones with blazing X patterns, guiding the main force toward the most vulnerable districts. At 12:15 a.m., the first bombs fell on Asakusa Ward. Not the familiar whistle of high explosives, but a different sound. The soft thump of canisters breaking open, followed by the whoosh of igniting gasoline. Within seconds, wooden houses erupted into towers of flame. The fire spread with terrifying speed, leaping from roof to roof like a living creature hungry for fuel. Civilians who had drilled for air raids found their preparations useless. Fire blankets disintegrated. Water buckets boiled away. Underground shelters became death traps, as superheated air sucked the oxygen from their lungs. Families who tried to flee discovered that the streets themselves had become rivers of flame. The wind began to howl. Superheated air, rising from thousands of individual fires, created its own weather system. Fire tornadoes, spinning columns of flame reaching hundreds of feet into the sky, carved paths of absolute destruction through the city. These weren't natural phenomena, but weapons of war, created by the precise science of incendiary bombing. By 3 a.m., the fire had created its own terrible logic. Hurricane-force winds, generated by the heat, spread burning debris across Tokyo like deadly snow. The Sumida River, where thousands sought refuge, began to boil. People who jumped in to escape the flames found themselves scalded by water heated beyond human endurance. The bombing continued for 3 hours, wave after wave of B-29s feeding the inferno with fresh fuel. By dawn, 16 square miles of Tokyo, an area larger than Manhattan, had been reduced to smoking ash. The weapon that shocked Japan had revealed its true power, not the ability to destroy buildings, but the capacity to erase an entire city from existence in a single night. Tokyo's agony was only the beginning. The success of Operation Meeting House unleashed a campaign of destruction that would roll across Japan like a tide of fire. General LeMay, emboldened by the results, immediately began planning the next target. If one city could be destroyed in a night, why not 10? Why not 50? 3 days later, Nagoya burned. The aircraft manufacturing center, once protected by distance and terrain, found itself defenseless against a new American strategy. Incendiary bombs rained down on the Mitsubishi plants, but they didn't stop there. The fire spread into residential districts, consuming homes, schools, and temples with equal hunger. Osaka followed within the week. Japan's commercial heart, the city of merchants and traders, became a furnace that could be seen from 100 miles away. The ancient temples of Nara, repositories of centuries of culture, vanished in walls of flame that turned Buddha statues into puddles of molten bronze. Kobe's turn came next. The great port city, gateway to the inland sea, found its wooden buildings no match for American incendiaries. Ships in the harbor caught fire from burning debris carried on the wind. The smell of smoke drifted across the Japanese countryside for days, a constant reminder that nowhere was safe. Each raid followed the same terrible pattern. Pathfinders would mark the target zones at midnight. The main force would arrive in successive waves, methodically feeding the growing firestorm. By dawn, another city would be gone, leaving only ruins and survivors who wandered through the ashes like ghosts of the living. The psychological impact was devastating. Japanese civilians, raised to believe in their nation's invincibility, watched helplessly as American bombers turned their cities into graveyards. Radio broadcasts still proclaimed victory, but the smoke rising from a dozen cremated urban centers told a different story. Industrial production, the supposed target of the campaign, actually became secondary to the broader goal of breaking Japanese morale. Factories could be rebuilt in months, but the terror of watching entire cities disappear overnight would last for generations. The weapon that shocked Japan was revealing its true power, not just to destroy but to traumatize an entire nation into submission. The morning after always brought the same haunting silence. Where once thriving neighborhoods had bustled with life, only twisted metal and smoking ruins remained. Survivors emerged from whatever shelter they could find, blinking in disbelief at a world transformed overnight into a hellscape of ash and memory. Kimiko Nakamura clutched her infant daughter as she picked her way through what had once been her neighborhood in eastern Tokyo. The little girl had not cried since the bombing. Shock had stolen even her tears. Every landmark Kimiko had known since childhood was gone. the school where she had learned to write, the temple where she had prayed for her husband's safe return from the Pacific, the market where she had bought rice with increasingly worthless yen, all erased as if they had never existed. The human cost was staggering beyond comprehension. Hospitals, those few that hadn't burned, overflowed with victims bearing injuries unlike anything doctors had seen. Third-degree burns covered entire bodies. Lungs seared by superheated air struggled for each breath. Children, their small bodies unable to survive such trauma, died by the thousands in the days following each raid. In Osaka, 15-year-old Hiroshi Tanaka wandered through the ruins searching for his parents. They had been separated during the panic when fire tornadoes began tearing through their district. He found their home reduced to a rectangular patch of ash, marked only by the twisted remains of his father's bicycle. His parents' bodies, like so many others, had been consumed so completely that not even bones remained. The survivors developed their own terrible vocabulary. They spoke of fire rain and burning wind. They described how the air itself had become poisonous, how people 30 feet from the flames had suffocated when the fire consumed all available oxygen. They told of families who died holding hands, found days later as small piles of ash that crumbled at the slightest touch. Yet even amid such devastation, moments of humanity persevered. Neighbors shared their meager possessions with strangers. Teachers led surviving children in songs to keep their spirits alive. Buddhist monks organized relief efforts, their temples serving as islands of compassion in an ocean of suffering. The psychological scars ran deeper than the physical ones. Many survivors reported the same recurring nightmare, the sound of aircraft engines overhead, growing louder and louder until they woke screaming. Children who had witnessed the firebombing refused to sleep indoors, convinced that any roof could become a trap of flame. For these witnesses to apocalypse, the weapon that shocked Japan had revealed something terrible about the nature of modern warfare, that in total war, there were no innocent bystanders, no safe havens, no protection from the flames that could rain down from a clear night sky. The horror of the firebombing campaign created fractures in both Japanese and American consciousness that would never fully heal. In Japan, the psychological impact was immediate and profound. Civilians who had endured years of shortages and air raid drills with stoic resignation found themselves confronting an enemy that could erase entire cities overnight. Whispered conversations in burned-out neighborhoods began to question what had once been unquestionable. If the emperor was divine, why couldn't he protect his people from the fire that fell from the sky? If the military sacrifice was noble, why were children dying in numbers that made the battlefield casualties seem small? The propaganda machine still churned out messages of inevitable victory, but fewer people were listening. Some Japanese civilians turned their anger inward, blaming themselves for insufficient devotion to the war effort. Others began to direct quiet resentment toward military leaders who had promised that such devastation was impossible. A few, speaking in voices barely above whispers, began to wonder if surrender might be preferable to watching every city in Japan burn to ash. Across the Pacific, American newspaper headlines celebrated the bombing campaign's success with grim satisfaction. "Tokyo devastated," proclaimed the New York Times. "Fire raids cripple Japanese war production," declared the Chicago Tribune. Editorial writers praised General LeMay's innovation and efficiency, calculating that each raid killed more Japanese than months of costly island-hopping campaigns. But not all American voices sang in harmony. Some pilots returning from the missions reported troubling dreams. They described looking down from their aircraft and seeing tiny figures running through streets of flame. figures that looked remarkably like the children playing in their own hometowns. A few chaplains questioned whether weapons that made no distinction between soldiers and civilians could be morally justified, even in total war. General LeMay himself seemed untroubled by such concerns. When asked about the ethics of incendiary bombing, he replied with characteristic bluntness, "We're at war with Japan. We were attacked by Japan. Do you want to kill Japanese, or would you rather have Americans killed?" For LeMay, the moral calculus was simple. Anything that shortened the war and saved American lives was not only justified but necessary. The psychological impact extended beyond those directly involved. Around the world, military strategists absorbed the lessons of the firebombing campaign. The weapon that shocked Japan had demonstrated that entire populations could be held hostage to the threat of instant incineration. The implications for future conflicts were staggering and terrifying. By the summer of 1945, Japan was a nation transformed by fire. 66 cities had felt the touch of American incendiaries. Millions of civilians huddled in temporary shelters, refugees in their own country. Industrial production had indeed declined, but more importantly, the psychological foundation of Japanese resistance was beginning to crack. The wooden cities that had made such inviting targets were largely gone, reduced to geometric patterns of ash visible from reconnaissance aircraft. What remained was concrete and steel, harder to burn, but also harder to hide. The firebombing campaign had achieved its immediate tactical goals, but it had also revealed the limitations of even the most devastating conventional weapons. Despite losing entire urban centers, Japan's government showed no signs of surrender. The military leadership, insulated in underground bunkers, continued to plan for the final decisive battle on Japanese soil. They spoke of acceptable losses in the tens of millions, of civilians armed with bamboo spears facing American tanks, of death before dishonor even if it meant the extinction of the Japanese people. The weapon that had shocked Japan, the carefully orchestrated rain of fire that could consume cities in hours, had proven both its terrible power and its ultimate insufficiency. Entire metropolitan areas could be erased, but the will to resist remained unbroken. Something more dramatic would be needed to force Japan's surrender. In the secret laboratories of the Manhattan Project, American scientists were putting the finishing touches on a different kind of weapon. The atomic bomb represented the next evolution in the logic of total war. If incendiary bombing could destroy cities, nuclear weapons could destroy them instantly, completely, with a power drawn from the very heart of matter itself. The irony was profound. By the time the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan had already experienced destruction on a scale that dwarfed those attacks. The firebombing of Tokyo alone had killed more people than either nuclear weapon. Yet it would be the atom, not fire, that finally broke Japanese resistance. The precedent had been set, the moral barriers already crossed. The weapon that shocked Japan in March 1945 had prepared the world for the unthinkable and made it seem almost inevitable. The sun rises differently over a city of ash. On the morning of March 10, 1945, as the smoke finally began to clear above Tokyo, survivors witnessed something that would haunt Japan's collective memory for generations. Where 10 million people had once lived and worked and dreamed, only silence remained. Broken occasionally by the sound of wind whistling through twisted metal and the distant cries of those still searching for the missing. The weapon that shocked Japan revealed its full horror not in the moment of impact, but in the days and weeks that followed. This wasn't simply destruction, it was erasure. Entire neighborhoods had been removed from existence so completely that maps became obsolete overnight. Streets that had carried names for centuries led nowhere. Temples that had sheltered worshippers for 1,000 years existed only in memory. Yet from this ashes of devastation, a terrible lesson emerged. The firebombing campaign had demonstrated that in the age of total war, there were no safe havens, no innocent bystanders, no protection from enemies willing to embrace the unthinkable. The distinction between soldier and civilian, between military target and population center, had been incinerated along with everything else. The survivors carried more than physical scars. They bore witness to a fundamental change in the nature of human conflict. War was no longer something that happened on distant battlefields between uniformed armies. It was a force that could reach into homes and schools and hospitals, consuming everything that made life worth living. Children who lived through the firebombing would grow up to become some of Japan's most passionate advocates for peace. They understood, in ways that no textbook could teach, what modern warfare truly meant. They had seen their neighborhoods transformed into furnaces, had breathed air that burned their lungs, had watched the sky itself become an enemy. The weapon that shocked Japan, that rain of jellied fire that turned entire cities into crematoriums, killed more people in a single night than many entire wars in human history. Yet, its greatest impact was not measured in casualties, but in the precedent it set. If such destruction could be unleashed with conventional weapons, what might be possible with the new technologies emerging from America's secret laboratories? The night Tokyo burned marked more than the beginning of Japan's surrender. It marked the end of one era of warfare and the beginning of another. In the decades that followed, military strategists around the world would study LeMay's campaign as a masterpiece of psychological warfare. The lessons learned over Japan would shape nuclear doctrine, influence the Cold War's doctrine of mutual assured destruction, and haunt the nightmares of anyone who dared imagine what the next total war might bring. As the morning light filtered through the smoke and ash, as survivors began the impossible task of rebuilding their lives from nothing, the echoes of that night of fire spread across the world. The weapon that shocked Japan had revealed a terrible truth about human nature, that in pursuit of victory, civilized nations could become the very monsters they claimed to fight against. The ruins still glowed with dying embers as history itself changed course, scarred forever by the night when fire fell from heaven and consumed an entire city in the span of a heartbeat. The age of total war had announced itself with a voice of flame, and the world would never be the same,